The first time I noticed the way people looked at me in the grocery store, I told myself it didn't matter. That was the biggest lie I told myself in 3 years. My name doesn't matter for this story, so I'll just tell you what happened, the way it happened. Starting on the morning, everything changed. I was 39 years old, and for 3 years I had been what the neighbors on our quiet street in a suburb outside Portland politely called not working. My wife, Claire, was one of the fastest-rising litigators at a corporate law firm downtown, the kind of lawyer whose name started appearing in local business journals next to words like formidable and relentless. I made her coffee every morning, packed her lunch, kept the house running, and picked up our nephew from school twice a week when my sister needed help. I read constantly, contracts, case law, old military manuals I still had memorized from another life. Nobody asked why, they had already decided the answer. Claire never asked either, not in those years. She had learned not to. There was a version of me that existed before I stayed home, and neither of us talked about him much anymore. I had spent 11 years as a judge advocate in the Army, first as a defense counsel, then in a division that handled something most civilians never think about: the legal aftermath of things that happen in war zones. Investigations, evidence chains, courts-martial. I was good at it in the specific, joyless way you get good at something that costs you pieces of yourself every time you do it well. My last case involved a young specialist named Marcus Delgado, a kid I had defended twice before for minor things, who was accused of something much larger during a deployment overseas. I believed him. I built what I still think was the strongest defense of my career. And 3 days before his hearing, evidence was quietly altered by someone protecting a more senior officer, and Marcus was convicted of something he didn't do. I couldn't prove the tampering in time. I never forgave myself for that, and 18 months later I hung up my uniform and told Claire I needed to stop. She held my hand in a parking lot outside Fort Bragg and said okay, without asking anything else. That was the kind of person she was, underneath the sharp suits and the closing arguments. She just never got to see that part of me applied to anything again because I made sure of it. I stayed home, I read. I waited for something in me to feel ready, and it never did. So when Mrs. Alvarez next door told her book club that Claire was carrying that whole household on her back, I didn't correct her. When my brother-in-law joked at Thanksgiving that I'd found the easy way out of the workforce, I laughed along and refilled his drink. I had decided, somewhere in those 3 years, that silence cost me less than explaining myself. I was wrong about that too eventually, but I didn't know it yet. Some mornings before Claire woke up, I would sit at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee going cold in front of me and think about Marcus. He would be 31 now if he'd made it. I still remembered the exact sound of his voice reading his own statement back to me in a cramped interview room, steady, certain. A young man who genuinely believed the truth would be enough if he just said it clearly enough. I had believed that too once. I don't think I fully believed it anymore, not for a long time, and that unbelief had settled into me like weather, quiet and constant, until I stopped noticing it was there at all. Claire never pushed me to talk about it. She'd bring up his name maybe once a year, gently, the way you check on an old wound to see if it's healed, and each time I'd change the subject, and each time she'd let me. I think she assumed, the way everyone did, that I had simply set that part of myself down and walked away from it. The truth was closer to the opposite. I carried it everywhere. I just carried it quietly in the books I read, in the way I still automatically noticed inconsistencies in paperwork, in the small ritual of checking every receipt, every statement, every document that crossed our kitchen table, as if I were still auditing evidence nobody had asked me to audit. Claire used to tease me early on about how carefully I read even our own utility bills. She had no idea what that habit actually was. Neither did I most days. Our life on the surface was ordinary in a way I had come to be grateful for. I made breakfast. I walked our dog around the block twice a day and knew every neighbor's schedule better than they probably would have liked. I picked up prescriptions, dealt with the plumber, sat through parent-teacher conferences for my nephew when my sister was working doubles at the hospital. None of it looked like anything. I understood that. I had built a life out of small, careful maintenance, the same way I once built cases out of small, careful documentation and sent days that felt like enough. It wasn't until Claire's world started cracking that I realized how much of the old instinct was still sitting there underneath the surface, coiled and patient, waiting for a reason. Claire's biggest case in 5 years landed on her desk that September. Her firm represented Halbrook Manufacturing, a mid-sized, family-owned company that made precision components for medical equipment. Halbrook was being accused, in a lawsuit backed by a much larger competitor called Ferris Dynamics, of falsifying safety compliance records on a batch of surgical instrument parts. If the allegations held, Halbrook wouldn't just lose the lawsuit. They'd lose their manufacturing license, 300 jobs, and possibly face criminal referral. Claire believed, and I believed her, that the Halbrook family was being set up. Ferris Dynamics had been trying to buy them out for 2 years and had been refused every time. For 3 months, I watched my wife disappear into that case the way she disappeared into every case that mattered to her, except this one ate at her differently. She stopped sleeping through the night. She started keeping a legal pad on her nightstand so she could write down thoughts at 3 in the morning. I made her coffee earlier and earlier, and she drank it faster and faster, and neither of us said much about it because we had our own private language of not saying things. The warning signs came quietly at first, the way they always do. A missing email Claire swore she'd sent, a vendor who suddenly wouldn't return her calls, a junior associate on her team who mentioned, almost in passing, that someone from Ferris Dynamics' legal team had approached him at a bar association mixer and asked oddly specific questions about Halbrook's internal documents. Claire mentioned it to me over dinner one night, frowning into her wine glass, and said it was probably nothing. I remember not liking the word probably. I didn't say wise. A week later, she mentioned that Halbrook's plant manager, a soft-spoken man named Owen who had worked there for over 20 years, had suddenly stopped answering her calls after being perfectly responsive for months. When she finally reached him, he sounded strange, clipped, apologetic in a way that didn't match his usual warmth. He kept saying he wasn't authorized to discuss certain files anymore, Claire told me, picking at her food. Authorized by who? He works for the company I represent. Did you ask him that? Of course I asked him that. He said he'd been advised by counsel. She set her fork down. Halbrook's counsel is me, Daniel. There's no other counsel to advise him. I remember the particular stillness that settled over me when she said that, the same stillness I used to feel in the seconds before an investigator handed me a file I already suspected was compromised. I didn't say anything that night beyond telling her to keep records of every call, every date, every strange conversation, no matter how small it seemed. She looked at me a little oddly when I said it, the way you look at someone who's suddenly speaking with more precision than the moment seems to call for, but she did it anyway. I think some part of her, even then, had started keeping that same file in the back of her mind, the one marked something is wrong here, and hadn't yet let herself read it all the way through. Then came the Thursday in November that took the ground out from under her. Ferris Dynamics' legal team, led by a senior partner named Griffin Talbot, filed a motion in open court accusing Claire directly of evidence tampering. They claimed the compliance certificate Halbrook had submitted, the document that proved the surgical parts had passed inspection, had been altered after the fact. They produced a forensic report from a document examiner claiming the digital metadata on the certificate had been manipulated using editing software roughly 6 weeks before it was submitted to the court, which would mean the original inspection date on the document was fabricated. If true, it wasn't just a lost case. It was fraud on the court, the kind of accusation that ends careers and licenses. Claire called me from the courthouse steps, and her voice didn't sound like her voice. They're saying I falsified it or that I let my client falsify it and used it anyway, she said. The bar association's already been notified. I'm off the case pending an ethics review. Griffin Talbot stood up in front of the judge and called me a liar, and I couldn't say anything because I didn't have anything to say yet. I stood in our kitchen holding the phone and felt something I hadn't felt in 3 years. Not grief, not the old guilt about Marcus Delgado. Something closer to recognition, like watching a familiar shadow move across a wall. Bring the original inspection files home tonight, I said. All of them, everything Halbrook gave you. There was a pause on the lines. Why? Anjay, us to bring them. She came home that night pale and quiet, carrying 2 boxes of files, and set them on the dining table like she was setting down something that might break. She didn't ask me again why I wanted them. Maybe she was too tired. Maybe some part of her already knew there was a reason I'd spent 3 years reading contract law and forensic procedure manuals in an armchair by the window while everyone assumed I was just filling time. I want to be honest about something here. I didn't sit down that night and immediately find the answer. I want you to understand that whatever happened afterward wasn't magic. It was work. The same slow, grinding, unglamorous work I used to do in a windowless office reviewing evidence logs until 3 in the morning. I went through Halbrook's inspection records line by line. I cross-referenced timestamps. I looked at file properties, metadata, print logs, even the serial numbers on the scanning equipment listed in the document headers. Claire sat across from me at first, watching, and then she started handing me things before I asked for them, the way people do when muscle memory returns faster than trust does. Around 1 in the morning, I found the first inconsistency. The forensic report Ferris Dynamics had submitted claimed the compliance certificate showed signs of being edited using a specific version of PDF editing software, one that added a particular kind of invisible formatting marker to altered documents. But the marker they cited didn't exist in that version of the software at all. It had been introduced 2 years later in a subsequent update. Whoever wrote that forensic report either didn't know that, or was counting on nobody checking. That's not a small mistake, I told Claire. That's the kind of mistake you make when you're describing software you've never actually used to fabricate something like this. She stared at me across the table, and for the first time in a long while, she looked at me the way she used to look at me across a different kind of table, back when I still walked into rooms that had my name on the docket. How do you know that? She said slowly. It wasn't really a question. I didn't answer right away, I just kept working. Around 2 in the morning, Claire made a second pot of coffee and sat back down across from me, watching my hands move through the stacks of paper the way you'd watch someone remember a language they hadn't spoken in years. You used to do this for a living, she said eventually. It wasn't a question either. A version of it, I said, different documents, different stakes in some ways, higher in others. You never talked about the work itself, only that you left it. There wasn't a way to talk about the work without talking about why I left, I said, not looking up from the page in front of me. And I wasn't ready for that conversation for a long time. She didn't push further. She just refilled my mug and kept handing me folders in the order I asked for them, the shipping logs, then the vendor invoices, then the original compliance certificate itself, scanned and printed at actual resolution so I could examine the header information properly instead of trusting a compressed PDF that had already passed through 3 different email servers. Somewhere around 4 in the morning, I found the invoice discrepancy. The payment for the forensic examination dated 11 days before the document it claimed to examine had even been entered into the record. I read it twice to be sure, then a third time, because I had learned a long time ago that the worst mistakes happen when you're certain enough to stop checking. Claire, I said, come look at this. She leaned over my shoulder, and I watched her go very still as she understood what she was looking at. They billed for testing a document before the document existed in the case, she said slowly. Either their examiner is remarkably careless with his own paperwork, I said, or he never actually ran the test at all and just wrote the report they paid him to write. Can we prove which one it is? We don't have to, I said. The panel just has to see the dates don't line up. After that, it's their examiner's problem to explain, not ours. Over the next 4 days, I found more. A vendor invoice for the independent forensic examiner Ferris Dynamics had hired showed the exam had been billed and paid a full 11 days before the compliance certificate in question, was even entered into the court record, which meant the examination supposedly proving fabrication had happened before there was anything to examine. I found a scheduling error buried in Ferris Dynamics' own internal shipping logs, subpoenaed months earlier and mostly ignored, that placed the surgical parts in question passing through Halbrook's quality control facility on the exact date the original certificate claimed, verified independently by a third-party freight company's own timist. AMP system that nobody had thought to cross-reference against the forensic report. I wasn't a lawyer anymore, not in any way that mattered on paper. My bar license from my Army days had gone dormant, technically still valid in the state since I'd never let it lapse out of some stubborn refusal to fully close that door. But I hadn't argued a case in over 3 years, and never in a civil courtroom, only military tribunals half a world away. Claire's ethics review hearing before the disciplinary panel was scheduled for the following Tuesday, and her own firm, worried about their own exposure, had assigned her a junior associate named Priya to represent her, a capable young attorney who had never handled anything close to this scale and knew it. The morning of the hearing, Claire sat at our kitchen table in a gray suit, staring at coffee she wasn't drinking, looking smaller than I had ever seen her look. "I don't think Priya can carry this," she said quietly. "And I'm not allowed to represent myself, not with my license already under review. I don't know what we do." I set my own coffee down. "I can represent you," I said, "if you'll let me." She looked up at me for a long moment. There was fear in her face and something else underneath it, something that had been waiting 3 years to be asked a question it never got to answer. "You still have your license." "I never let it go." "You haven't been in a courtroom in 3 years." "I know." "People are going to say things," she said, "about you, about us." "They already do," I said. "At least this time I'll be standing up when they say it." She almost smiled. It was the first almost smile I'd seen from her in weeks. The courthouse that morning felt exactly the way courthouses always feel before something is about to break open, full of a particular kind of quiet tension that people who spend their lives in them learn to recognize the way sailors learn to recognize weather. I wore the one suit I still owned from before, the one Claire had kept pressed in the back of our closet for 3 years without either of us ever mentioning why. I walked in beside her and I heard the whispers start almost immediately, the way I knew they would. "Isn't that her husband, the one who doesn't work? He's representing her at an ethics hearing." Griffin Talbot was there too, seated near the front with 2 associates, since Ferris Dynamics had every incentive to see this hearing go badly for Claire. It would clear the path for their lawsuit entirely. He glanced at me once, the way you glance at something you've already decided isn't worth a second look, and went back to his notes. On his way past us in the hallway, he'd paused just long enough to say, with a thin, practiced smile, didn't realize Claire had hired outside help. "Should be a quick morning." Claire's jaw tightened, but she didn't answer him. I didn't either. There was nothing useful in answering a man like that before you had the floor. Priya leaned toward me while we waited for the panel to be seated, her voice low. "Are you sure about this? Fangold doesn't tolerate grandstanding. If you overreach on even one point, he'll shut the whole thing down, and it reflects on Claire." "I'm not planning to grandstand," I said. "I'm planning to read dates out loud." She looked unconvinced, but she nodded anyway because there wasn't time left for anything else. The disciplinary panel was headed by a retired judge named Wallace Fangold, a stern, silver-haired man known around the courthouse for running the tightest ethics reviews in the state. When the hearing opened, Talbot's associate stood first and walked the panel through the forensic report, confident, polished, practiced. Then it was our turn. I stood, and Priya, sitting beside Claire, looked at me with the particular relief of someone glad not to be the one standing. "Your name and role for the record," Judge Fangold said. I gave my name. "I'm appearing today on behalf of Claire with the panel's permission under my existing license." Fangold studied me for a moment, then nodded for me to continue, the way you'd nod at someone whose credentials you intended to watch closely for the first sign of a stumble. I laid it out the way I would have laid out evidence in front of a court-martial panel a decade earlier, plainly, in order, without theatrics, because theatrics are for people who don't have the facts. I walked them through the software marker that didn't exist in the version the forensic report claimed. I walked them through the invoice dated 11 days before the document it supposedly examined had even entered the record. I walked them through the freight company's independent timestamps that placed the surgical parts moving through inspection exactly when Halbrook's original certificate said they had. None of this requires anyone in this room to take my word for anything, I said. Every document I'm referencing is already in the record Ferris Dynamics themselves submitted or in material subpoenaed months ago and never withdrawn. I'm not asking the panel to trust an interpretation. I'm asking the panel to look at dates that don't match on documents both sides agree are authentic. Talbot rose, his composure fraying slightly at the edges. Your Honor, with respect, this is an unlicensed civilian raising technical objections about forensic software he has no demonstrated expertise in. Judge Feingold held up a hand before I could respond. Mr. Talbot, your own forensic examiner's report is what's being challenged. If the metadata marker he cites doesn't exist in the software version he claims produced it, that's not a matter of courtroom theater. That's a matter of whether his report describes reality. He turned to me. How do you know this detail about the software version specifically? I spent 11 years reviewing forensic documentation for the Army's legal corps, Your Honor, primarily digital evidence chains in overseas investigations. I've seen this particular kind of error before in a different case a long time ago. It cost someone everything because nobody caught it in time. My voice didn't shake, but something in the room went very still when I said it. Feingold's expression shifted, just slightly, the way it does when a person recognizes something they've heard about rather than something they're hearing for the first time. 11 years with JAG, he repeated slowly. Overseas investigations. Would that have included the Delgado court-martial by any chance, Fort Bragg, roughly 4 years ago? So the room went quiet in a different way now. Yes, Your Honor, I said. I was his defense counsel. Judge Feingold stood up from the panel bench. It wasn't a dramatic gesture, no gavel, no raised voice, just a man rising slowly to his feet in a room that hadn't expected him to. Talbot blinked in confusion. Claire looked up at me, startled. I sat on the appellate review board that overturned Specialist Delgado's conviction 18 months after his court-martial, Feingold said. Once the tampered chain of custody records finally surfaced through an unrelated inspector general audit. I remember the case file. I remember the original defense counsel's closing argument being the only reason there was enough of a paper trail left to reopen it at all, even though the verdict itself couldn't be undone in time to matter for that young man. I always wondered what happened to the lawyer who wrote that argument. I assumed, frankly, that a case like that would have driven a person out of the profession entirely. He paused. I see now that it very nearly did. I didn't trust my voice for a moment, so I said nothing. Claire's hand found mine under the table. Feingold turned back to the panel and to Talbot's team, his voice returning to its formal register. This panel will require Ferris Dynamics' forensic examiner to appear in person and account for the discrepancies raised today under oath before this ethics review proceeds any further against Ms. Claire. Given the nature of the allegations now on the table, I am also referring the forensic report itself for independent review by the State Crime Laboratory. He looked at Talbot. I'd encourage your client to consider very carefully what an independent review is likely to find. Talbot didn't have much to say to that. The independent review took 6 weeks. It found exactly what I expected it to find. The forensic examiner Ferris Dynamics had hired had never actually run the software analysis he claimed to have run. He'd been paid a flat fee to produce a report supporting a predetermined conclusion, and he'd been sloppy about it in ways that unraveled under real scrutiny. He lost his own certification. Ferris Dynamics' lawsuit against Halbrook Manufacturing was dismissed with prejudice, and the company's outside counsel opened a separate inquiry into whether Talbot's firm had known about the fabricated report before filing the original motion against Claire. Claire's ethics review closed with a finding that she had done nothing wrong, and a formal note in the record commending the diligence of the defense presented on her behalf. Halbrook kept their manufacturing license. 300 people kept their jobs. Claire went back to work the following month, quieter than before, in the way people get quiet after something nearly took everything from them and didn't. The night the review closed, we sat out on our back porch longer than we usually did, the dog asleep between our chairs, neither of us in a hurry to go inside. Claire turned her wine glass slowly in her hand and asked me the question I think she'd been sitting on since the hearing. "Why didn't you ever tell me you kept the license active? 3 years, Daniel. You let me believe that part of your life was just gone." "I didn't know how to explain it without explaining all of it," I said. And I didn't. "Think I deserve to use it again, not after Marcus." She was quiet for a while. "You didn't fail him, you said it yourself in that hearing. The chain of custody was tampered with by someone else. You did everything right with what you had." "I know that now some days," I said. "I didn't know it for a long time." "You could have told me you were struggling with it. I would have wanted to know." "I didn't want you to marry the version of me still stuck in that room," I said. "I wanted to give you someone whole. It took me a while to understand that meant actually dealing with it, not just going quiet and hoping it settled on its own." She reached over and took my hand, and we didn't say much else that night. Some conversations don't need an ending, they just need to finally happen. Something else happened too, something smaller that I think about more than the courtroom victory. Mrs. Alvarez stopped me in the driveway about 2 weeks after the story made the local business section, coffee mug in hand, and said a little too brightly that she'd always thought there was more to me than met the eye. I told her that was kind of her to say. I didn't need her to understand it. I understood it now myself, which was new. Claire and I really talked for the first time in years about what came next. I didn't go back to military law. That door had closed the way it needed to close, and I've made peace with that. But I reactivated my license fully, and I started taking on a small number of civil cases, mostly forensic evidence disputes, the kind of work almost nobody wants because it's slow and unglamorous and requires you to read the same document 40 times looking for the one inconsistency that matters. It suited me. It still does. People still ask sometimes why I spent 3 years at home while my wife built her career, as if those years were wasted, as if quiet meant empty. I don't correct them anymore, not because I'm avoiding the conversation, but because I finally understand something I couldn't have told you back when Mrs. Alvarez was gossiping through her window. Some of the most important work a person does happens where nobody's watching, in the years before anyone thinks to ask what you're preparing for. I wasn't hiding. I was healing slowly the only way I knew how, and I was still paying attention the whole time, waiting for the moment it would matter again. When it finally did, I was ready, not because I had planned it that way, but because I had never really stopped being who I was. I had just been waiting for someone to need him again. These days when I walk into a courtroom, nobody whispers about the unemployed husband anymore. Some of them remember the hearing. Most of them don't know the story behind it at all, and that's fine. I'm not telling it for their benefit. I'm telling it because somewhere out there is probably another person sitting quietly at a kitchen table, letting the world decide who they are based on what they're not currently doing, and I want that person to know what I didn't know for 3 long years. Quiet isn't the same as empty. Sometimes it's just a season where you're gathering everything you'll need for the moment that finally asks something of you. When that moment came for me, I was ready, not because I had a plan, but because I had never actually put the work down. I had only ever set it aside long enough to heal.